in Britain about allegedly the misuse of state power. Nobody thinks Miranda is a terrorist, but were the authorities right to use all and any powers available to find out whether he carried secret information? I mean, that's what they're there to do, isn't it? I mean, if they think somebody is carrying secret information that they shouldn't have, they get arrested. That's what happens.
Yes, they've got a case. The other side has got a case in this. They are the defenders of national security, and they are better equipped to judge it than The Guardian or other newspapers. Guardian now working with the New York Times to protect its sources and keep the story going. It's never easy here. Why Mr. Miranda came back via London is a slight puzzle to me. He was going from Glenn Greenwald, a New York lawyer turned journalist who lives in Brazil. It's hard for people to keep up with this, with a woman called Linda Poitras, who's a filmmaker and an investigative one, very good one, living in Berlin and outside the jurisdiction of both the US and the UK. And he came back via London and they picked him up. He never came into Britain, of course. He was held in limbo in transit.
That's the point, isn't it, about this law?
His rights, what you might in America call his Miranda rights, funny coincidence, his rights were not available to him. He didn't get a lawyer. They offered him a government lawyer, but he wanted his own lawyer and he wanted a translator. So I'm pretty sure, as you implied in your introduction, they used the wrong law, but they were, I guess, entitled to stop him and find out what was going on.
And it has not escaped other members of the press in Britain that The Guardian exposed alleged wrongdoing in other newspapers which involved alleged illegal activity. So if The Guardian, or people working on behalf of The Guardian, or couriers working with people on behalf of The Guardian are engaged in potentially illegal activity, well, that's tough on them, isn't it?
Well, we're all in favour of upholding the law, and the justification for what Mr. Greenwald, Mr. Miranda were doing, and Edward Snowden, the whistleblower, who incidentally, for my money, is a very impressive witness. He wasn't like Bradley Manning, who was sentenced to 35 years this week and changed his name and gender. Mr. Snowden was a man with a very good life, living in Hawaii with a very good salary and a girlfriend. And he decided that when he saw what he was seeing as a National Security Agency contractor was going on, the technology far exceeding the capacity of the regulators to control it, and he saw, as he judged it, his bosses lying to Congress about what they could do, he threw all this away. And there was no doubt, I've spoken to colleagues of mine who've spoken to Snowden, he knew, they said, do you realize what you're doing to your own life if you go public as you've done? And this man, sounds pretty sane to me, decided he should. And on balance, I think so far we've had the best of the argument. And what's more, the two things the British government did this week, stopping Miranda under terror laws and then requiring my deputy editor take a hammer to a hard drive, absolutely futile gesture, that we're winning this argument.
It's very interesting that, because we engaged in a debate at the Edinburgh Festival this week in which about whether people trust the intelligence services, and it was very clear from the audience there at least that they think that the intelligence services still have a Cold War mindset, whereas the public in Britain has a post-Iraq war mindset and doesn't actually trust a lot of what they're being told.
Yes, you notice, Gavin, the audience, about 600 of them, and upper middle class people and highly educated, and personally, I was shocked. All of them were against the intelligence service, and they don't trust them. There is the question of, how can we trust them after the, the saga of Iraq weapon of mass destruction? So, and they were against the police. They were very supportive to The Guardian and very supportive to Snowden. And it's unbelievable. This I thought those middle class will be reserved, at least when it comes to the trust of the
Not sure it's the same as Glasgow. What do you think?
Well, as somebody from Glasgow, I think it might very well have been. People are very concerned about this, aren't they? I mean, they're very. Do you think?
What worries me about all this, and by the way, just responding to you, I actually think Manning is a complete hero, regardless of his personal circumstances.
But he's a less good witness, Rachel. That was the point I was making.
I will put them on the same level. But no, what worries me about this situation is that we're so concerned with, should the Guardian have done this, shouldn't they? I mean, I absolutely think they should have public interest here is very clear. But we seem to be a bit, whatever, about the things that Snowden has revealed, which is a spectacular level of surveillance that we have a right to know about, that the government has lied to us about having. And we seem to be more concerned with the story about Snowden and about Miranda, which is important. But we're losing focus on what the actual story here is, which is about the surveillance and how much scrutiny there is of that.
We haven't had that debate in this country on anything like the same extent as they have in the US, where they have the First Amendment. They couldn't smash New York Times hard drives, or in Europe, particularly in Germany, Thomas is being quiet, where they're all too familiar with what the Stasi and their predecessors can do. So it's a much more sensitive subject in the German election, I think, than it has been here
I think the
so
government
far.
has lost its case for trust of the people, and no wonder they have, because they are asking, they continue to argue that they want to find needles in haystacks, and in order to succeed in that, they require the entire haystack. And that is, I think, where their case is lost. We do not believe that it is right to hand over everything that is our right of privacy for the purpose of finding some, no-goods, which are obviously hiding behind all this, and something has to give. I'll be interested to see now what happens in the debate, Michael, after you have decided to hand over the material to the New York Times. We will have a competition between two judicial systems, how the Americans will deal with it and how this country is going to continue to deal with it.
We know the answer to that because 1971, the Pentagon Papers, you're old enough to remember Daniel Ellsberg. Again, he was a great criminal and traitor, but he got away with it over the Vietnam War and misconduct in the Vietnam War. And there is no prior restraint, which means in the US, you can't say to a newspaper, you cannot, under the Official Secrets Act or anything else, you cannot be stopped publishing that. So they're in a much stronger position than we are, even though Snowden and Greenwald came to The Guardian because they had doubts about the New York Times and the Washington Post. Gavin's original question, who decides the national security? New York Times was too cautious for Greenwald Snowden's support in this one. They came to us.
Yeah. But Michael, the excuse they are taking that, they managed, the American President Obama said, we managed to abort about 50 terrorist attacks. So in order to justify all these kind of surveillances and interception of our
different stories
calls,
about that. I'd be willing to believe them, but I'd need to be persuaded with rather more substantial evidence than sweeping generalisations.
Let's not lose sight of a very important issue here, which is that the border control in the UK is lawless. Nobody has any rights there, not just journalists. Lots of other people get caught up in this law, and that's a loophole that obviously needs to be addressed.
Which is something which is being examined.
Which is something that is now being examined.
The Daniel Ellsberg case is interesting. One of the reasons he got away with it was not just because the law was on his side, it was also there was a public awareness at the time that the Vietnam involvement is wrong. And there was a majority opinion in all of America at the time that you cannot support this war. And you have a similar situation now where Snowden is going to get away with it because the majority of people do not trust the intelligence services as they used to.
Why shall we?
The argument that is made by William Hague and is also made in a different way in the United States is they're under civilian control, there's civilian oversight, it's all done in the best possible taste, everything is absolutely tickety-boo because I am the Foreign Secretary and I sign off on this.
But since 9/11, the United States has lived in a real sense under a state of emergency. A surveillance society where the technology has raced ahead in both countries of the legislation which gave the green light to some of these activities, and the regulators, as well as being all too often complicit with the system. I don't say that unkindly, but you get producer capture, I think is what the businessmen would call it. The politicians, Dianne Feinstein in the US Senate, where they have armed guards on the door of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Been there, probably so have you. We don't have that here. We have Sir Malcolm Rifkin, former Foreign Secretary, and he's signed up for the project. So we're not convinced that the people who hold government and surveillance agencies to account are rigorous enough or determined enough to uphold what Rachel rightly calls our interests in these matters, as opposed to the interests of the state.
OK, we'll leave it there. That's it for Dateline London for this week. We're back next.